He built a life no one could find. Deep in the desert where even buzzards had room to circle. But when a letter came with 4 names and a plea, his isolation shattered. Before we dive deeper into this twisted story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and enjoy. He wasn't ready for love or to be called Pa. The last sound Hank Bigfoot Hunter expected to hear in his wasteland was the thunder of hooves and the cry of a name not spoken in years. He blinked once, twice, still gripping the rusted pickaxe handle like it was the only thing tethering him to this scorched earth. Heat shimmered cruel across the canyon floor, dust devils dancing on the horizon like ghosts. No one ever came out this far. No one even knew how. That was the point. But the voice called again, closer this time, and he caught the shape coming into view through the haze. A young man on a lathered horse, clutching something in his hand like it burned him worse than the desert sun. Hank didn't move. Not until the rider dismounted, boots sinking into red sand, and stepped forward with something like guilt hanging heavy on his sun-darkened brow. "I've been riding for 3 days from redemption," the messenger panted. "I was told to find you." Hank's voice scraped low and dry. "Nobody told you, right?" The rider flinched but held out the folded letter anyway. "It's from Preacher Morrison. You were the only name left." He didn't want it. Didn't want paper or people or the past. But the rider's hands trembled and something inside Hank gave way just enough to take it. The seal cracked with a whisper. The ink had run from sweat or tears. Maybe both. Hank read the first line and his world went still. "Rebecca's gone. The children are alone. You're listed as next of kin." He didn't finish the rest. He didn't need to. Just 4 lines, 4 names and 1 sentence that broke through a decade of self-imposed exile like thunder across the wasteland. The letter fell from his hand, caught by the desert wind. "How old?" he asked quietly. The rider cleared his throat. 10, 7 and 4. "And the woman, her name's Anna. She married your brother 2 years back, said you were the only one they had left." "My brother's dead too?" The rider nodded. Hank turned his back to the wind, staring out toward the mesa's edge. Cactus stretched for miles, endless and harsh under the blazing sun. "I ain't seen him since the war," Hank murmured. "I know," the boy said softer now. "But the kids?" "I heard you." For a long moment, neither moved. The heat pressed down like a weight. Then Hank sighed, not loud, not dramatic, just tired. He jerked his chin toward the adobe shack built into the cliff face. "Water troughs behind the rocks. Rest your horse. You'll ride back tomorrow. I got things to gather." The rider blinked. "You're going?" Hank didn't answer. He didn't have to. He left the next morning with only what he needed. Rope, jerky, a canteen of tepid water, and the worn Colt that hadn't been fired since Gettysburg. Heat rose in waves from the red rock, making every step treacherous. He took no trail, just instinct and memory, like the desert still owed him something, and he meant to collect. By sunset, the first settlement blinked into view. He didn't stop. He reached redemption by the next evening, his clothes caked with dust and his throat raw from the dry air. The church stood weathered near the center, its bell cracked and silent. Preacher Morrison met him at the steps like he'd been waiting for years. "Hank Bigfoot Hunter," the old man said, voice like gravel in a dry creek. "Preacher, I wasn't sure you'd come." "Neither was I." They didn't waste words. The preacher led him behind the church to a small adobe house, too cramped for comfort, too silent for the living. "She died a week ago," the preacher said as they walked. "Anna's doing what she can, but the boy don't speak much. The middle girl don't sleep, and the youngest cries for her mama near every hour." Hank's boots slowed at the door. "And my brother died in the mine last spring. Anna stayed for the kids. She ain't blood." "No," the preacher said, "but she stayed anyway." Hank stepped inside. The first thing he saw was the girl, dark-haired, thin as a whisper, standing by the clay oven with a bowl in her hands too big for her frame. She looked up when he entered, eyes wide but not scared, just empty. Beside her sat a boy, maybe 10, eyes narrowed like he'd already made up his mind about the world. A little one clung to his knee, thumb in her mouth, watching him like a hawk. Then she stepped in from the side room. "Anna, taller than he expected, sturdy in build, not soft, not fragile. She carried the weariness of too many blazing days and too few cool nights, but her eyes were steady. "You're Hank," she said. He nodded. "I am." A beat passed. "Preacher said you're the only kin left," she added. So he said, "They don't know you." He glanced toward the children. "Neither do you." "No," she said, "but Rebecca always said you were the good one even when you left." He winced. She saw it. Didn't apologize. "They need stability. I can't raise 3 on my own in this heat. And I don't expect to keep my name on anything. But if you came for them, they'll need more than a roof and shade." Hank didn't speak. The littlest one toddled toward him then, tiny boots scraping the packed earth floor. She tugged on the hem of his dusty coat. "You look like my paw," she whispered. Hank froze. The boy rose fast, grabbing her hand. "Don't bother him, Macy." But Hank knelt slowly, meeting the girl's eyes. "What's your name?" "Macy." "And you?" He looked up at the boy. "Thomas," he said stiff. "And that's June." The middle child didn't speak, just stared, eyes shadowed and sleepless. Anna cleared her throat. "They call me Ma. You don't have to take me, but they can't be split up. Not after losing so much." Hank stood slowly, hat in hand. "You ride?" She nodded. "Then pack what's needed. We leave at dawn." They rode out before sunrise, when the desert air still held a whisper of coolness. Macy fell asleep in the saddle within the first hour, curled against Anna's chest. June stayed near silent, clutching a cloth doll that had lost most of its stuffing. Thomas didn't speak, but he kept close behind Hank, as if watching how a desert hermit moved could teach him how to survive. They made camp in a canyon that night. Wind howled through the red rocks, but their small fire stayed lit. Anna handed him a tin of beans warmed over the flames. "You always live out here?" 10 years. "Why?" He shrugged. "War takes things from a man." She didn't ask more. Across the fire, Macy whispered in her sleep. Thomas sat sharpening a stick with his pocket knife. June stared at the flames like she could see something no one else did. "You think this will work?" Anna asked quietly. Hank looked at them, 3 children who weren't his and a woman who bore no blood tie, and saw the weight pressing against his solitary life. "No," he said then, "but I'll try." Anna nodded. "That's more than most gave us." They didn't say anything else that night. The next days were hard. Macy cried every morning for Rebecca. June refused to eat some days. Thomas kept wandering off with a knife too big for his hand, trying to be useful, trying to be something more than burden. But slowly, something shifted. June followed Hank when he hunted for game, watching without speaking. Macy began humming again, clutching his leg when the heat grew too fierce. And Thomas started asking questions. "How do you track jackrabbits? How deep do you dig for water? What do rattlers fear most?" The boy who once barely looked at him now shadowed his every step. Anna tended the adobe dwelling with quiet strength, cooking, mending, never complaining about the dust that settled on everything or the way the heat made sleep impossible some nights. One morning, Hank found her crying behind the water barrel, wiping her eyes with the hem of her dress. She didn't know he saw. He didn't say anything. But that night, he left a carved lizard on her windowsill. Just wood, but carefully done. She found it before sunrise and didn't speak of it. But she smiled that morning. Then came the tracking. Late one afternoon, Hank found fresh boot prints near the spring, prints that weren't his, weren't from anyone in the family. The tracks were deep, deliberate, circling the water source like someone studying their habits. No horse prints, which meant whoever it was had walked here. In this heat. That took planning. Matthew examined the tracks closer. Big boots, worn soles, a slight drag to the left foot. Military issue, prop. The kind of boots a man wore when he planned to stay standing, no matter what. He followed the trail to the edge of the property, where it disappeared into rock. But carved into a barrel cactus, fresh as morning, was a crude marking, the letter slashed deep into the flesh. Hank stood there as the sun beat down merciless, jaw clenched. The past had found them. And it wasn't finished. That night he gathered them around the table after supper. The oil lamp flickered against the adobe walls, throwing long shadows. "Someone's been watching us," he said simply. Anna's hands stilled over her mending. Thomas looked up sharp from cleaning his knife. June's eyes widened, but she didn't speak. Macy kept playing with her corn husk doll, humming. "Who?" Thomas asked. "Don't know yet. But they left a calling card." Anna set down her needle. "What kind?" "The kind that means trouble." He didn't mention the bee carved into the cactus. Didn't need to frighten them more than necessary. But he moved the rifle closer to the door and checked the loads before bed. The next morning brought more signs. A dead roadrunner hung from the fence post, neck twisted, wings spread wide like a warning. Fresh horse tracks circled the property, 3 riders this time, moving slow, methodical. Hank cut down the bird and buried it without ceremony. But his movements had changed. Sharper now, more focused. Like a man preparing for war. "We need supplies," he told Anna over breakfast. "Real ammunition, medical kit, enough food for a siege." "You think it'll come to that?" "I think it already has." They rode to Redemption that afternoon, all of them together. Hank wouldn't leave anyone behind, not with stalkers in the desert. The general store was stifling in the heat, but the proprietor was helpful enough. Boxes of cartridges, bandages, salted meat, flour. Everything a family might need to hold out for weeks. As they loaded the wagon, a woman approached. She was perhaps 50, weathered but kind, with gray hair pinned back severe. "You're the Bigfoot Hunter," she said. "That's right. Name's Mrs. Garrett. I run the boarding house." She glanced toward Anna and the children. "Heard you took in the Crowder orphans. They're family now." She nodded approvingly. "Good man. But you should know, there's been talk. Some drifter named Briggs has been asking questions. About the woman, about the children. About you." Hank's blood went cold. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that ain't his business to ask. Sheriff's been looking for him, but he keeps to the desert. Like he knows the land." "What's he look like?" "Tall, lean, face like leather. Missing 2 fingers on his left hand. Rides a black mare with a white star." She paused. Mrs. Crowder seemed to know him. Got pale as death when someone mentioned his name. Hank looked toward Anna, who was helping June into the wagon. She hadn't heard the conversation, but something in her posture had changed. Tighter. More alert. "Much obliged for the warning," he told Mrs. Garrett. "Watch yourself, Hunter. Some men don't know when to let things lie." The ride home was tense. Anna kept looking over her shoulder. Thomas rode with his hand on his knife. Even little Macy seemed to sense something, clinging tighter to her doll. As they crested the ridge overlooking their homestead, Hank saw it. Smoke rising from their property. Not from the chimney, from the chicken coop. "Stay here," he ordered, but Anna was already spurring her horse forward. They arrived to find the coop in ashes. The chickens scattered or dead. And nailed to their front door was a piece of paper with a message scrawled in charcoal. "She was mine first. The kids deserve better than a hermit." Anna stared at the note, face white. Daniel gasped, eyes wide, heels scraping against the warped floorboards. Hank didn't squeeze harder, but he didn't let go either. "I walked away from war," he growled. "From brothers dying in trenches, from blood in desert sand. I came to that canyon to bury what I couldn't forget." He leaned in closer, voice low as distant thunder. "But I'll dig it all back up if you make me." Then he dropped him. Daniel crumpled to the floor, coughing, gasping, face red as the rocks outside. Hank knelt beside him. "If I see your shadow anywhere near my family again, I won't bury you." And with that he stood and left. Outside, the children waited in the wagon, eyes wide in the lamplight. Thomas stepped forward as Hank emerged. "Is it over?" "No," Hank said, "but it's changed." "What now?" "Now we go home." The ride back was faster. No threats, no signs, just wind through the canyon walls and the growing ache of something shifting beneath the surface. Hank had tasted something he hadn't felt in years: rage. Not survival, not endurance. Rage. And it frightened him more than he'd admit. That night, back at the adobe house, after the children were asleep and the fire was low, Anna sat beside him with her mending in her lap. "You didn't kill him," she said quietly. "No. Why not?" Hank didn't answer for a long time. "Because I've done enough killing," he said at last. Anna nodded, her hand brushing his where it rested on the arm of the chair. "He'll come again," she whispered. "I know. And we'll be ready." Hank looked over at her, eyes dark but strong, mouth set not in fear but in resolve. He reached into his coat and pulled out the small box, placed it on the table between them. "What's this?" He opened it. Inside lay a simple silver ring, tarnished but whole. "My mother gave this to my father the day they buried their first child," he said. "She said it was to remind them what they still had." Anna stared at it, breath caught. "I'm not good with promises," he said, "but I'll keep this one." She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She slipped the ring onto her finger and leaned her head against his shoulder. Outside, the night wind began to blow, carrying the scent of distant rain. But inside the house, something had taken root. Not safety, not peace, but family. And family was worth fighting for. The days that followed were quieter but not peaceful. The heat eased its grip on the canyon, cooling to merely brutal instead of deadly. Yet the danger held firm in every shadow. Rocks still bore the scars of flash floods, and the wind whispered through the cracks in the adobe walls like a secret trying to find its way in. But inside, something had shifted. Subtle at first, then more solid as the days lengthened. Hank woke earlier than usual now, not from fear or habit, but something deeper. Responsibility. Purpose. He'd once lived by the sun, rose when it did, and slept when it fell. But now he often woke before dawn, rising to check the water barrels or reset the traps, sometimes just to sit and watch the stars fade over the canyon rim with a cup of bitter black coffee warming his hands. Thomas joined him most mornings. The boy never said much, he wasn't one for chatter, but he sat beside Hank on the stone ledge, shoulders straight, eyes following every movement. If Hank noticed him flinch at noises in the rocks, he never pointed it out. Just let the silence teach him what it could. When they spoke, it was in single words, gestures, half-formed thoughts that only made sense between men who were still learning how to be seen. "Heat's breaking," Hank said one morning, testing the air. Thomas nodded. "Water's running clearer in the spring. Means we start the vegetable garden soon." The boy didn't reply. Just picked up the old spade leaning against the side of the house and started digging where Hank had marked the plot with stones. He didn't need to be told. Not anymore. Inside, Anna was teaching June to weave baskets from desert grass. The girl didn't take to words easily, but her hands were quick and her focus sharp. She worked the fibers like she'd been born doing it, fingers moving in small, even strokes. Anna watched her carefully but said little, correcting only when needed. "You don't have to be perfect," she whispered once, adjusting a loose strand. "Just steady." June nodded, eyes never leaving her work. Macy played near the hearth, humming a tune she claimed was her mama's favorite. She made little dolls out of corn husks and strips of cloth, giving each one a name and a voice, playing both roles with quiet intensity. Every once in a while, she'd hand one to Hank when he came inside, and he'd pretend to tuck it into his shirt pocket. She'd giggle then, go back to her creations. Anna watched all of it with a heart half empty, half full. The children were beginning to feel like they belonged again, like the world wasn't about to rip them apart. But she also knew it couldn't last. Not as long as Daniel Briggs was alive and free. The first real sign came just after midday, when the heat made thinking difficult. A rattlesnake, not the snake itself, but a crude carving of one, burned into the face of the boulder near their water source. The wood was fresh, the edges blackened. It hadn't been there that morning. Hank stood in front of it, jaw tight. Thomas saw it too. The boy didn't ask questions, just stood beside him, jaw matching the line of his guardian. June brought a drawing to Anna that evening, a man with long arms and a snake coiled around his boots, standing behind a crooked house. The lines were dark, frantic. Anna didn't scold her, just folded the paper and tucked it into the stove without a word. Hank watched the smoke twist up from the chimney and curl out into the desert air. Daniel wasn't just testing them anymore. He was circling. They began preparing the house in earnest. Not with panic, not even with fear, but methodically, like a family who'd already survived too much to be caught sleeping. Hank reinforced the door with iron bands and dug trenches around the perimeter for flash flood drainage and tripwires. Thomas strung warning bells from old tin cans, scavenged and cleaned. June helped pack bags with essentials, bandages, hardtack, spare water, just in case, Anna had said, though no one asked what for. Macy built a fort under the table and declared it her castle. She invited her corn husk dolls to keep watch from the corners. Anna started carrying the rifle, not always in hand, but always nearby. Then came the letter. It arrived the way poison does, quiet and close to home. Tucked inside the grain barrel, tied with a strip of rawhide. Hank found it at dawn. The writing was a mess of charcoal and smudged fingerprints, but the message was clear. One more warning. Leave the canyon or burn with it. He didn't show it to the children. He burned it like the others. But Anna knew. She saw the way his hand trembled afterward. The way he walked the property 3 times before breakfast. That night they sat at the table long after the children had gone to bed. The oil lamp burned low. The fire crackled soft behind them. Anna placed her hand over Hank's. "I'm not leaving," she said simply. "I know. Even if it means." "I said I know." She paused, then leaned forward, forehead resting against his. "I didn't come here to survive another man," she whispered. "I came here to live with you." Hank's jaw clenched. He hadn't cried in years, but something about her voice, the way it shook but didn't break, dug through the armor he'd built. He nodded once. "Then we make our stand." It came the next night. Not a scream this time. Not a fire. But footsteps, many, heavy, measured. Hank heard them first, just past midnight. He was already dressed, rifle in hand. Anna joined him in seconds, her own weapon slung across her back. She kissed Macy's head where she lay asleep, brushed June's cheek, and whispered something in Thomas's ear before he stood and reached for the spare hatchet. They didn't speak again. Didn't have to. The night outside was black, not just from clouds or absence of moon, but thick, unnatural, like the shadows themselves had grown teeth. Then the voice came. Not a knock. Daniel had grown bolder. "Crowder!" Daniel's voice echoed off the canyon walls, cheery like he'd come to borrow a cup of sugar. "Thought I'd stop in for a visit. You still got that pretty little widow with you?" Thomas stiffened, fists clenched. Hank opened the window shutter a crack. "You step 1 foot closer and I'll drop you where you stand." Daniel laughed, the sound bouncing off stone. "Oh, now don't be like that. I brought gifts." One of the men behind him lifted something. A cloth sack, then dumped it. A roadrunner, freshly killed, blood still dark in the sand. "That was yours, wasn't it?" Girl's little drawing come to life. "Thought I'd make it real." June gasped behind them. Hank fired. A single shot clean. The man holding the sack dropped, bullet through his shoulder. He screamed, crumpled to the ground. Daniel didn't laugh this time. "Next one's through your heart," Hank said, voice carrying across the heated air. Daniel's smile faltered. His hand hovered near his hip. Anna stepped outside then, rifle aimed. "You've had your fun," she said. "Now go." "You think I'm afraid of some woman with a borrowed gun?" She cocked it. "You should be." For a moment, the night held its breath. Heat radiated from the rocks even in darkness. Then Daniel spat in the sand, grabbed his wounded man by the collar, and backed away. "This ain't over," he growled. "You think you can hide in this canyon forever, Hunter? Family or not, you're still alone." Hank stepped forward. "I ain't alone." Anna stood beside him. Thomas behind him. June watching from the window, eyes shining. And Macy, sleepy but aware, whispered from behind the door, "Pa's not scared." The men vanished into the rocks. But they left behind blood, smoke, and a silence heavy with unfinished war. Hank didn't go back to bed. He sat by the door, rifle across his knees, and watched the sun crawl up over the canyon walls like a slow burn. He wasn't afraid. Not anymore. By morning, the ground was marked, not just with boot prints, but with the weight of choices made. Blood darkened the sand near the water trough. The trail Daniel and his wounded man took twisted off through the rocks, dragged and messy, like they'd been too proud to run but too hurt to stand tall. Hank didn't follow it. Not yet. He stood in the doorway, staring at that trail like it was a rattler that hadn't yet struck. Inside the house, the fire still burned low. Anna moved quietly between the rooms, checking on the children. Macy slept again, curled beneath the quilt Hank's mother had once sewn, fingers still tangled in her corn-husk doll's dress. June was awake, sitting upright on her bedroll with her Roadrunner carving gripped in one hand like a shield. Her eyes didn't blink when Hank looked down at her. She just nodded once, stronger than her silence. And Thomas had kept watch the rest of the night, seated by the back window with his hatchet laid across his knees. He didn't fall asleep, not even for a second. When Hank passed him to check the rifle by the fireplace, the boy only whispered, "If they come back, we don't wait." Hank didn't correct him. Not anymore. There was no boy left in that voice. There was only resolve. Anna joined him near the stove, brushing dust from her skirt. "They won't stop." He didn't need to answer. "I think they'll come again before the week's out," she continued. "He's humiliated. You shot his man. Humiliated men don't think. They just burn." Hank nodded. "That's why we finish it first." Her brows drew together. "What are you saying?" "I know where he goes when he's licking his wounds. That old mining camp near Devil's Canyon, the abandoned shaft with the shack behind the ridge. It's the only place with shade and water for miles." Anna folded her arms. "You want to ride out alone?" "No. I want him gone. But I don't plan to die making that happen, and I won't leave you here defenseless." She stared at him long, then spoke softer than before. "You mean to take Thomas?" Hank turned toward where the boy sat, alert and listening. Thomas was already on his feet. "If he wants to come," Hank said. Thomas nodded without hesitation. Anna stepped forward, reached up, cupped Hank's jaw with both hands. "If you die out there, I won't." She studied him. Not the way a woman studies a man for comfort, but the way a soldier studies the map before battle. Then she kissed his cheek, turned away, and began packing a satchel with bullets, jerky, and a flask of strong coffee. Thomas joined her, wordless, tightening his boots with calloused fingers. June walked over, silent as ever, and handed Hank a folded drawing. It was a picture of their house still standing, smoke from the chimney, 3 figures on the porch, one tall, one medium, one small, and in the sky, a sun breaking through storm clouds. Hank folded it and tucked it into his coat pocket without a word. They left before the heat grew unbearable, when the desert air still held a whisper of mercy. Hank on his gelding, Thomas riding the mare behind him, bundled tight and quiet. Anna stood at the edge of the house with her rifle resting on one hip, barrel pointed down but ready. June and Macy stood on either side, one clutching the other's hand like it was all they had. "You come back," Anna called. Hank didn't turn. "I will." Thomas looked back once. Macy lifted her hand in a small wave, whispering something only the rocks could hear. The ride south was different this time. No longer cautious reconnaissance. Now it was calculated hunting. Hank led the way with the ease of a man who'd memorized every stone, every slope. He had learned the land as a place of peace and isolation. But now he thought of it like a map of weaknesses, places men could hide, choke points where riders could be ambushed, ridges where snipers could wait. They stopped once to rest the horses near a natural spring. Thomas sat beside him on a boulder, unwrapping a piece of hardtack. "You ever kill a man before?" the boy asked suddenly. Hank didn't flinch. "Yes." "Was it hard?" "Yes." Thomas nodded like that was the answer he'd expected. "Will it be hard this time?" Hank stared at the small fire they'd built for coffee. "It's always hard. If it's not, something's wrong with you." Thomas chewed slowly. "But you'll still do it." Hank nodded. "Because it's harder to watch someone you love suffer when you could have stopped it." The boy said nothing after that, but he moved a little closer to the fire and didn't sleep much. By the next day, they reached the ridge overlooking the old mining camp. It wasn't much, just a weathered shack tucked beneath an overhang of red rock, mostly shielded from sun and hidden from view unless you knew exactly where to look. Smoke rose from a makeshift chimney. Hank lowered his field scope. 3 of them for sure. Daniel and his wounded man, plus someone new. Thomas shifted in his saddle. Do we wait for dark? Hank shook his head. No. Waiting lets doubt in. He handed the boy the scoped rifle. Stay here. This spot's perfect. You've got sight on the front door and the east window if anyone runs. Do I shoot? Hank turned. You fire if they pull a gun. Not before. Thomas nodded, hands steady on the weapon. Hank crouched low and began circling wide, using the scattered boulders for cover. He moved like a ghost, silent, patient. The heat was his ally now. It made sound travel strangely, masked his approach. He waited at the rock formation near the back of the shack, listening. Voices inside, faint, arguing. Daniel and the injured man, plus another voice, younger, eager. Something about revenge. Something about taking the woman by force. Hank felt his blood go cold. He waited until the voices paused, then moved fast. Boot met door. The back entrance shattered inward, drywood splintering. Gun up, finger ready. The first man inside turned, reaching for his belt. Hank shot him clean in the thigh. He crumpled screaming, clutching the wound. Daniel spun from the table, pistol already in hand, but a second shot rang out, not from inside. From the ridge. Daniel stumbled, blood blooming on his shoulder. He screamed, spinning. Hank didn't hesitate. One shot to the leg. Daniel collapsed, swearing, screaming. The third man, barely 20 and shaking, threw his hands up. Don't shoot. I ain't armed. Hank approached, boots slow, deliberate. You just tried to plan assault on a woman and children, he said. You threatened my family. You burned my property. Daniel coughed, eyes wide now, the arrogance bleeding out with his blood. Hank aimed again. This time the bullet missed his head by an inch, embedding in the wall behind him. Next one ends it, he growled. Or you start talking. I'll tell you everything. Just don't, please. You got one chance. Then I turn you over to redemption's law. And if they don't hang you, I'll come back and finish it myself. Daniel swallowed hard and started to talk. By sundown it was done. Daniel confessed to the fire, the threats, the harassment. The man he'd brought along, Cray, was the one who'd planted the dead coyote, who'd scouted their home and carved the snake. They'd planned to burn the house and rescue Anna. Make it look like an accident, then lay claim to the land and the woman. Thomas joined them soon after, face pale but steady. I saw everything, he said. He raised his gun first. Hank nodded. They tied Daniel and his accomplices to iron rings set in the rock wall, chains taken from the old mining equipment. Then Hank rode for redemption. It took 3 hours in the heat. The sheriff met him at the jailhouse, grumbling about jurisdiction until Hank laid Daniel's signed confession on the desk. When the man read the line about plans to assault children, his jaw clenched hard. I'll take it from here, he said grimly. By the time Hank and Thomas returned to the canyon, the stars were out and the rocks had finally begun to cool. Their house glowed warm in the darkness, lamplight spilling from the windows like hope. Anna stood on the porch, rifle resting against the door frame, lantern in hand. The girls came running. Macy screamed his name, dust flying from her bare feet. June said nothing, just threw her arms around his waist and held tight. Anna kissed him full on the mouth, her hands trembling. I thought you wouldn't come back, she whispered. I said I would. Thomas stood beside them, eyes glinting in the lamplight. Anna stepped forward and pulled him into a hug. For a moment, the boy stiffened, then melted into it. You saved us, she whispered. No, Thomas said, looking up at Hank. Pa did. And for the first time since before the war, Hank Bigfoot Hunter smiled. Summer came like a blessing. Not sudden or overwhelming, but steady, just the way this family needed. The heat settled into a rhythm they could work with, blazing at midday, warm at dawn and dusk, cool enough at night for rest. The desert bloomed in ways most people never saw. Cacti flowered. Hidden springs ran clear. Birds returned to nest in the canyon walls. So did peace. But this time it was the good kind. Not the kind that made your bones ache with loneliness or your heart clench in fear, but the kind you could live in. The kind that gave you space to breathe, to rebuild, to listen to your children laugh without flinching. For the first time in years, Hank Bigfoot Hunter let himself do just that. The house, battered by storms and threats, stood strong. The children's drawings still hung by the hearth. The rifle still sat near the door, but untouched now. Not because it wasn't needed, but because it didn't need to be clutched. Daniel Briggs and his partners had been taken to the territorial prison in Yuma. The sheriff had wired word that all 3 men had confessed again, this time under oath. Daniel would spend the rest of his life breaking rocks under the Arizona sun. Cray had cried like a child during questioning, begged for forgiveness from people who never even knew his name. They were gone now, but their shadow remained. Not sharp, not looming, just a smudge on the edge of every bright moment. Macy was the first to call Hank Pa without hesitation. It happened on a morning when the sun rose earlier than usual, orange bleeding across the sky like a gentle fire. She skipped into the kitchen barefoot, hair wild, holding a flower she'd picked from beside the water barrel. "Pa," she said, beaming, "this is for your hat." He froze, then knelt slowly, taking the crushed desert bloom from her small hands and tucking it into the band around his hat. "You think it'll stay?" he asked. She nodded proudly. "It's strong like you." He didn't speak, just touched her hair gently and let her run off humming. Anna had been watching from the doorway. She didn't say anything either, just smiled at him like she knew he'd been waiting for that moment longer than he'd ever admit. She sang sometimes while cleaning. She started planting herbs near the kitchen window in clay pots. She even made new curtains, pale yellow ones, stitched by her and June together. The house softened under her care, not losing its strength, but gaining something gentler. The kind of touch only a woman brings when she's finally not just surviving, but choosing. She still wore the silver ring Hank had given her. Every morning she touched it like a prayer. And when they lay side by side at night, her hand always found his. They didn't need words. They'd already spoken them in the quiet things, building, protecting, choosing. Then one day, a letter arrived, brought by a rider from Redemption, a boy no older than Thomas. He handed Hank the envelope with nervous fingers. "It's official looking," he mumbled. "Came from the territorial courthouse." Hank opened it slowly, read the lines twice, then handed it to Anna. She read, then looked up at him. "You're listed as their legal guardian," she whispered. "All 3. Permanently." Hank nodded. "Paperwork caught up is all." Anna stepped forward, hand on his chest. "You're really their father now." "I always was." He looked toward the children, who were out back digging irrigation channels for the vegetable garden. Thomas had a bandana tied around his head against the sun. June was laughing, which was rare and precious. Macy waved from the top of a rock pile, shouting something about lizards. Anna leaned in close. "You want to make it official? All of it?" Hank turned to her, brow furrowed. "You asking me to?" "No," she interrupted gently. "I'm asking you if you want to." He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the same silver ring. It had never left him, just waited. He held it out. "You sure?" Anna laughed. It was the first full laugh he'd heard from her. "Hank Bigfoot Hunter," she said, "I've lived through war, death, fire, and fools. I'm sure." He slipped the ring on her finger again. And this time it wasn't just a promise. It was a life. The wedding happened under the cottonwood tree by the spring. Not many guests, just the preacher from Redemption, the children, and a few neighbors who'd started settling in the area after hearing the threats were gone. Anna wore the same dress she'd worn the day they first met, patched and faded but clean. Hank wore his old cavalry shirt, brushed and mended. Macy scattered desert flowers instead of rice. June held the Roadrunner carving in one hand and Anna's skirt in the other. And Thomas stood by Hank's side like a second shadow. When the preacher said, "Husband and wife," Hank turned to Anna and kissed her, not quickly, not for show, but deeply, like a man who'd earned the right. The children cheered. Macy screamed, "That makes us a real family now." Hank scooped her into his arms. "We always were." The house filled with warmth after that. Neighbors brought food. The preacher stayed for dinner. Thomas played a harmonica someone had given him, badly, but with heart. The fire burned late, and laughter echoed off the canyon walls. When night fell, Hank stepped out onto the porch alone for a moment. The desert spread wide beneath the stars, silver and endless. No shadows, no threats. Just the wind, soft now, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. He heard footsteps behind him. Anna leaned against the door frame beside him, her shoulder brushing his. "You ever think we'd have this?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not once." She smiled. "I did." He turned to her, one hand sliding around her waist. "You saw all this before it happened?" "No," she said. "I just hoped hard enough that it might." He leaned in and kissed her temple. Inside, the children laughed, voices mixing with the night sounds of the desert. Hank took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "I was supposed to die alone," he said quietly. Anna reached for his hand. "God had better plans." He nodded. And this time, the silence didn't ache. It sang. 3 months later, another letter arrived. Hank opened it slowly on the porch while Anna shelled beans beside him in the shade. It was from the territorial governor's office. One of the circuit judges had heard about the fire, the threats, the arrest and imprisonment of Daniel Briggs, and the fact that Hank had taken in 3 orphan children and a widow with no legal claim to him. The letter offered 2 things. First, formal recognition of guardianship and property transfer, land, livestock, and water rights, including the small plot near the spring that once belonged to his late brother. Second, a question. Would he consider accepting a territorial post? The nearest township wanted to establish a rotating civil committee for desert jurisdiction, resolving disputes, filing claims, settling disagreements before they became gunfights. They wanted Hank Bigfoot Hunter. He read the letter twice. Anna raised an eyebrow. "They want to make you sheriff?" He shook his head. "Worse. They want to make me reasonable." She smirked. "Heaven forbid." He folded the letter. "I'd rather hunt rabbits." But later that night, he sat on the porch alone, letter in hand, and considered it. Not because he craved authority, but because the land he loved was changing. People were returning to the desert. Settlers with children, miners with families, widows looking for clean water and solid ground. Someone would need to help them settle disputes without fire and fists. Maybe it didn't need to be someone loud. Maybe it just needed someone steady. That weekend they hosted their first Sunday gathering. Word had spread somehow, no invitations were sent, but they came. Riders from neighboring canyons, widows and farmers, men in patched shirts and women with children clinging to their skirts. The house yard was full by afternoon. Dishes clinked. Coffee boiled over the fire pit. Someone brought a fiddle. Thomas played harmonica to accompany it, better this time. Anna prepared food for 12 and fed 24 more. She never once looked overwhelmed. Just smiled, handed out plates, and accepted compliments from people who hadn't eaten in company in months. Hank walked among them like a man who still couldn't quite believe he was part of it. He kept one hand on Macy's shoulder most of the day. She clung to him like he was the root holding her to the ground. And maybe he was. One neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Chen, took Anna's hand near sunset and said, "That husband of yours looks like the kind of man who could stare down a dust devil and make it change direction." Anna smiled. "He does stare down dust devils. He just waits until they pass." Hank heard that, pretended he didn't. But when he passed Anna a cup of coffee minutes later, their fingers touched, and he looked at her with something fierce and soft all at once. The kind of look only a man who'd lost everything and found more than he deserved could give. Later, after the guests had gone and the moon cast silver light across the canyon, they all sat on the porch together. Hank, Anna, Thomas, June, and Macy, who had fallen asleep with her head in her mother's lap. No one said anything for a long while. The only sound was the night wind, warm and full of desert songs. Then June spoke, just one word, "Home." Thomas looked at her, then at Hank. He nodded. "Yeah," he said. "It is now." Anna looked to Hank, her eyes gleaming in the lamplight. "You believe it now?" she asked. "That you belong here?" He looked at the land, the stars, the family gathered close. "Yes," he said simply. Then, after a pause, "I believe I was meant to." Anna leaned into him. June reached for her brother's hand. Macy snored gently, limbs tangled in her skirt. And Hank, once a man who lived by silence and distance, closed his eyes, rested his head against the porch post, and breathed deep. The desert would still be harsh. The heat would still come. Flash floods would rage through the canyon again. Rattlers would hunt the edges of their land. People would disappoint. Seasons would hurt. But now, for the first time in years, Hank Bigfoot Hunter wasn't just braced against it all. He was part of something built to last. Not just shelter, not just duty. Family. And in the vast, unforgiving desert, they had found their oasis. "Briggs," she whispered. Hank pulled the note down, crumpled it. "You know him." "I thought he was dead." "Well, he ain't." That night, they didn't sleep. Thomas stood watch by the door, knife in hand. June curled against Anna's side, awake but silent. Macy whimpered until exhaustion took her, and Hank sat by the window, Colt resting across his knee. "Who was he?" Thomas asked around midnight, voice rough with something too old for his years. Anna didn't answer right away. She held June close and stared at the dying fire. "He was before your pa. A mistake I thought I'd left behind in Kansas. A man who wanted what he couldn't keep." "Was he your husband?" "No," she said firmly. "He thought he owned me." "There's a difference." Thomas didn't ask more, but the way his jaw clenched, the way he didn't look away from the dark beyond the window, said enough. By morning, the heat had returned with vengeance. Not just weather, but the oppressive weight of being hunted. It painted the rocks white-hot and blurred the trail Daniel had taken, as if the desert itself wanted to erase him. Hank stood outside, arms crossed, watching the wasteland like a man waiting for an ambush that never came. Anna joined him, shawl tied around her head despite the heat. "He won't come back during the day," she said, though her voice betrayed doubt. Hank didn't reply. "He's a coward," she added. "Always was." Still, he said nothing. "You believe that, don't you?" Hank looked at her, then back to the endless expanse of red rock and sage. "Cowards come back when they think you've let your guard down." Anna swallowed. "Then we won't." The days that followed were hotter, but not calmer. Thomas pushed himself harder, hauling water until his arms shook. June began having nightmares, waking in the night with cries she never voiced in the day. And Macy grew clingy, refusing to leave Anna's side when the sun reached its peak. Hank worked the land, repaired the chicken coop, reinforced the adobe walls with stones and mud. Every night he checked the rifle and barred the door with a heavy beam, and every morning he looked out over the desert for any sign of Daniel. None came. One afternoon, Thomas followed him to the edge of the property. He didn't speak at first, just walked beside him as Hank reset snares around the perimeter. "You ever scared?" the boy asked finally. Hank paused, then knelt to adjust a tripwire. "Of what?" "Of him coming back." Hank considered the question, then nodded. "All the time." "So what do you do?" "Keep watch. Keep working." Thomas frowned. "That's it?" Hank glanced over. "You want me to say something pretty? I don't have that. Just truth. You get scared, you work through it." Thomas chewed on that. "Did you ever have kids?" "No." "Why'd you come for us then?" Hank looked out over the sand. The valley beyond was blinding white, untouched by shade. "Because someone had to," he said. Thomas nodded slowly. "I'm glad it was you." A week passed. The heat began to break in the evenings. The spring ran clearer with seasonal rains to the north. And animal tracks began to appear near the edge of the property. June smiled for the first time when Hank gave her a carved roadrunner. It wasn't much, just whittled wood, but she held it like treasure. Macy stopped crying every night, started helping Anna with the cooking. Thomas chopped his first full pile of kindling and beamed when Hank nodded approval. It was working. It was slow, hard, aching, but it was working. And then came the fire. It started in the storage shed. No lightning, no accident, just flames, sudden and hungry in the pre-dawn darkness. Hank woke to the smell of smoke and the roar of panic. He burst out the door with a bucket in hand before the others even stirred. But it was too late. The shed was engulfed, supplies burning, heat lashing out like a wild beast. Anna came running, grabbing Macy and June. Thomas stood frozen, eyes wide. Hank grabbed the boy by the shoulder. "Get every bucket from the well." Now. Thomas moved, but even with the buckets, even with sand packed against the walls, the shed couldn't be saved. They got some supplies out, but lost most of their winter stores. By dawn, the shed was ash and twisted metal. Anna sat in the red dirt, hair matted with soot, holding Macy tight. June stood in silence, face streaked with smoke. Thomas punched the adobe wall until his knuckles bled. And Hank stared at the charred ground, jaw tight. This wasn't an accident. He knew it like he knew the desert, like he knew the feel of a loaded gun in his hand. Daniel had come back. And next time he wouldn't stop at the shed. They buried what couldn't be saved behind the house. Macy cried until she hiccuped. Anna held her while Thomas dug in the hard-packed earth. June placed a stick carved like a cross at the mound. Hank didn't speak. He was already thinking 3 steps ahead. By nightfall, he had set new traps beyond the property line, rigged warning bells from old tin cans, and carved false trails into the rock to confuse anyone tracking them. Anna found him cleaning the rifle. "Are we safe?" He looked up. "No." "Then what do we do?" He checked the chamber, loaded 6 bullets. "We prepare." That night, Thomas didn't sleep. He sat by the window, sharpening his blade. June curled by the dying fire, Roadrunner carving in hand. Macy whispered prayers with her eyes shut tight. Anna sat beside Hank, hands clasped, voice low. "I don't know how to make them feel safe again," she said. "You don't," he replied. "You just stay. That's what they need. And you. I've been waiting to fight for something that mattered." She looked at him then, long and quiet. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered. Hank nodded. "I know." The storm was coming. But this time they wouldn't run. They'd built something worth keeping. And Hank Bigfoot Hunter wasn't about to let it burn. The days after the fire passed like waiting for thunder after lightning. Everything was quiet, but too quiet. That sharp, brittle kind of stillness that told you something was out there watching, waiting in the heat shimmer and rock shadows. The desert held its breath, and so did the people living in it. Hank never spoke of Daniel Briggs, not in front of the children, not even with Anna when the nights grew long and the fire burned low. But he checked the rifle each morning before the sun had fully risen. He kept traps reset, widened the perimeter of snares, moved the water barrels closer to the house so no one had to linger in shadow. Everything he did said what his mouth would not. The man would return. Anna noticed. She began keeping a pot of water boiling at all times and a lantern lit even when it wasn't needed. She carried a long knife tucked in her apron, not dramatic, just there. Not for show, but for survival. Thomas was changing too. His sharp edges had softened in the weeks since Hank arrived, but the fire hardened him again. The fear had taken root, turned inward. He walked with his shoulders high, tense like a coyote watching for something it couldn't quite name. He helped Hank without being asked now, hauled water before dawn, asked for extra chores. And when he thought no one was watching, he sat by the window with a hatchet across his lap. June had begun to sleep more, but she still didn't speak unless she had to. The fire had made her skittish again, and she'd taken to drawing on scraps of bark with bits of charcoal. They were odd drawings. A man in a wide hat, a wolf in the rocks, a house on fire, and sometimes a large shadowy shape behind a child. Macy was too young to understand the danger in full, but she understood the silence. She clung tighter to Anna. She whispered her prayers a little louder now. At night she asked questions in the dark. Will the fire come back? Will Pa scare the man away? And Anna always answered, yes, baby. Pa will keep us safe. Each time she glanced toward Hank and caught him watching from the shadows. He never said anything. He just nodded once, like he heard her. Like he agreed. Then 3 days later, the coyote came. They didn't own one. Hadn't seen one in weeks. But that morning, Hank found the carcass by the fence line. Thin, mangy, bones like a map of suffering under the matted fur. But that wasn't what stopped him cold. It was the note pinned to the coyote's flank with a whittled stick, a scrap of cloth torn from Anna's old shawl, used as parchment, and in smeared charcoal, 3 words. Next time inside. Hank didn't call for Anna. He didn't show the children. He dug a shallow grave with his bare hands, buried the coyote, burned the note, and salted the ground around the fence. Then he returned to the adobe house and quietly moved a second rifle to the door. The next week turned their lives into a slow, deliberate ritual of caution. No one stepped outside alone. Anna never let Macy out of her sight. Hank taught Thomas how to handle a rifle, carefully, patiently. He didn't give him bullets, just the weight of it, the rules, how to hold, how to clean, what it meant to use it. Thomas didn't smile the way most boys would. He just listened, wide-eyed, quiet. June drew more, but her drawings changed. She started sketching their house with thicker walls, with stronger doors, and sometimes she drew Hank, bigger than life, standing between the house and a shadowy figure with a wide hat and sharp teeth. Anna said nothing about the drawings, but she hung one of them by the hearth, and Hank noticed. That Friday, while checking the water pump, Hank heard something strange. A bell. Not a church bell, a small one, tiny, faint. He turned fast, hand to the colt. Nothing. But when he walked the perimeter, he found it hanging from a dead mesquite tree. An old dinner bell, rusted thin, tied to the branch with what looked like a child's bootlace. Another message. This one louder. He cut it down and smashed it under his boot until it was fragments. Then he returned to the house and told Anna they'd be sleeping in shifts from now on. She didn't ask why. She just nodded and set up a bedroll by the front door for herself and June. 2 nights later, it happened. Not a knock this time. This time it was the scream. Not human, animal. Hank jolted from sleep and grabbed the rifle, heart thundering in his chest. Thomas met him at the door, already pulling on his boots. The boy had slept dressed for 3 days straight. They burst into the yard just in time to see flames licking at the lean-to where they kept the goats. Inside, nothing but bleeding terror and the stench of burning hay. Hank scanned the rocks, heard movement, saw nothing. He fired once into the darkness. The echo rang across the canyon like judgment. When Anna ran out, he didn't explain, just said, "Stay inside." That night, he didn't sleep. He stood watch while Thomas dozed beside him, curled like a pup, hatchet still in hand. And Hank whispered something no one heard. Not even the desert. By morning, he had made up his mind. "We're going to redemption," he told Anna over coffee. "All of us." She looked up sharply. "Why?" "Need answers. Briggs is getting bold. Someone's giving him information about our movements. And I aim to find out who. But it's a day's ride in this heat." "I know. What if he comes while we're gone?" "He won't." Anna hesitated. "How do you know?" "Because he wants an audience." They rode out that afternoon, when the sun hung like a curse in the white sky. Macy rode with Anna, arms around her waist. June sat behind Hank, silent but alert. Thomas rode a borrowed horse beside them, clutching his pack tight. The desert stretched long and merciless ahead, but for once it didn't feel like exile. It felt like a mission, like war. They reached redemption just past dusk the next day. Everything was dim and dusty. The general store was closed. The church stood weathered and empty. But lights burned in the saloon. Hank tied the horses and told Anna to wait at the boarding house with the children. He walked through the batwing doors alone. The saloon was smoke and shadow, a few drunks, a piano with half its keys missing, and one man at the bar with a face too clean for a place this dirty. Hank sat beside him, didn't order a drink, didn't say a word. Just laid a bullet on the scarred wooden counter. The man glanced at it, then at Hank. "You the one from the canyon?" Hank nodded. "I heard about you. Heard you took in a widow and some orphans. Heard you used to be Rebecca Crowder's brother-in-law. And heard someone's making your life hard." Hank didn't blink. "Where's Briggs?" The man swallowed. "Ain't my place to say." Hank leaned closer. "It is now." The bartender looked around nervously, then slid a folded note across the counter. Hank opened it. A crude map, a circle around a place called Devil's Canyon. 2 days south. Back into the wild. Back into shadow. He stood to leave, but the bartender grabbed his wrist. "You go down there, you best bring more than words." Hank didn't smile. "I'll bring fire." Outside, Anna waited with the children, faces worried and half asleep in the lamplight. He didn't explain. He just said, "We ride tomorrow. South." "For what?" Anna asked. Hank looked at her, And for the first time something in his voice cracked just a little. "Because no one's running us off our land," he said. "And I don't aim to die with unfinished business." They rode at first light, when the desert air still held mercy. Macy sang quietly to her doll. June didn't speak but watched the horizon. Thomas studied the terrain with eyes like iron. And Hank led them, rifle strapped tight, jaw clenched. The man who had once chosen isolation now rode with a family, with a reason, with a reckoning. The trail south to Devil's Canyon wasn't just a path through the wasteland. It was a descent into every shadow Hank Bigfoot Hunter had tried to outrun. The land turned vicious fast. Deep arroyos choked with thorned brush, black rocks twisted by ancient heat, and an air that pressed dry into bone. No birds, no scurry of small animals, just the sound of hooves on stone and the occasional soft cry from Macy when the sun grew too fierce for her pale cheeks. They rode tight formation, with Anna and the children bracketed between Hank and Thomas. The boy didn't complain once, not when his horse stumbled on loose scree, not when his hands blistered from gripping the reins in the heat. He watched his surroundings like a sentry and copied every move Hank made. If Hank leaned in the saddle to scout a bend, so did Thomas. If he stopped to listen, Thomas held his breath. In 2 weeks, the boy had gone from a cautious orphan to a fierce shadow. Hank saw it and didn't say a word. Words cheapen things like that. Anna stayed steady in the saddle, quiet strength radiating from her posture alone. Macy clung to her, humming softly beneath the cloth tied over her head. June said nothing, but her gaze rarely drifted from Hank's back, as if she knew whatever came would meet him first. Devil's Canyon wasn't a town so much as a dying scar. 3 buildings built into the canyon walls, a church half-collapsed from flash floods, and a water trough green with algae. Smoke curled from one chimney, the saloon, always the saloon, and a battered sign hung by one chain from the front post, creaking with every gust of superheated wind. Hank reined in first and scanned the area. No movement, just heat waves and the stench of something foul hanging near the well. "We stay together," he said. "No one leaves the horses." Anna's hand tightened on Macy. Thomas nodded, already reaching for the knife at his side. June moved closer to her brother without a word. Hank dismounted and stepped through the sand toward the saloon. His boots sank with each step, dust sucking at the soles like the land itself didn't want him here. Inside was worse. Dark, too dark for midday. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and rot. 4 men sat at scattered tables, none of them talking, none of them looking up. Behind the bar stood a woman, tall, thin, and hollow-eyed. She didn't flinch when Hank entered, just poured a drink and placed it on the counter as if she'd seen this scene before. "Hank Bigfoot Hunter," she said flatly. He stopped short. "That's right. Daniel said you might come." Hank approached slowly, eyes never leaving hers. "Where is he?" She nodded toward the back, toward stairs that disappeared into shadow. "He's up there waiting." "You live with him?" She laughed, dry and bitter. "Nobody lives with Daniel. They survive around him." Hank stepped past the bar and toward the stairs. "He got help up there?" "2 men," she said. "Rougher than he is. He pays them in whiskey and promises." Hank paused at the bottom step. "You got kids?" She blinked. "No." "Then stay behind the bar." And with that, he climbed. The second floor of the saloon was a long hallway with 3 rooms. The first 2 doors hung open, empty bunks, ratty sheets. The third door was closed, the smell of tobacco and sweat leaking from under the frame. Hank raised his hand and knocked once. A voice inside drawled, slow and smug. "Told you he'd come." The door creaked open. Daniel Briggs leaned against the far wall, shirt unbuttoned, suspenders hanging, a glass of something dark in one hand and a pistol resting casually on the table beside him. His face was still lean and hard, like the desert had baked him into leather. Only the eyes gave him away, wilder now, sunken, mad at the edges. "Well," Daniel grinned. "Ain't this a reunion?" Hank didn't move from the doorway. "You burned my shed." Daniel shrugged. "Allegedly. You left a dead coyote with a threat carved in it." "Maybe. You came for what isn't yours." Daniel's grin widened. "Ah, now we're getting to it. I came to end this." Daniel sipped from the glass and gestured lazily with his damaged hand, the one missing 2 fingers. You brought the little wife and children down from your hideout for that? Not very neighborly of you, Hank. What if something were to happen to them while you were up here? Hank stepped into the room. So fast that Daniel's glass shattered against the adobe wall as he reached for his pistol, but it was too late. Hank's boot sent the weapon skittering across the room, and his hand closed around Daniel's throat with a force that lifted him an inch off the wall. You think I'm here to threaten? Hank hissed. I came to deliver.